For this second half, we will explore to the service guideline that has been updated by LHDN on February 9, 2024. These guidelines serve as a comprehensive roadmap, providing guidance on the issuance of e-invoice across the 13 key focus area as shown in the slide. We will go through each of these areas to get insight and clarity on the crucial aspect outlined by LHDN. This slide shows the overview of the process involved in issuing e-invoice to the buyer. I give you two scenarios. Scenario yang pertama, when the buyer requests an invoice, the supplier is required to issue the e-invoice based on the transaction. Berdasarkan guideline yang ada, so the supplier need to complete the information needed and submit the invoice for validation by LHDN. Once the supplier receive the verified invoice, supplier must share and submit it to the buyer. Okay. Untuk senario yang kedua, kalau kata pembeli tidak memerlukan e-invoice, the supplier may issue a standard receipt, bill or invoice to the buyer, praktis yang sama macam bisnes sekarang. So the supplier will then need to consolidate all receipt, bill and invoice and submit a consolidated e-invoice monthly to LHDN for validation purpose. Okay, mana yang tak memerlukan e-invoice, so supplier kena buat consolidated e-invoice secara bulanan kepada LHDN for validation purpose. In details, if untuk issue invoice to buyer, sekiranya buyer memerlukan e-invoice, individual buyers ada pilihan to provide their TIN number, iaitu nombor cukai pendapatan, or my card number or both. Okay. If an individual buyer provide either their TIN or my card number, the supplier need to key in a general public identification number or TIN number. The general public identification or TIN number are defined by LHDN as stated in slide. Okay, sekiranya kalau kata buyer tu bagi sahaja TIN, so untuk nombor IC tu maknanya boleh letak 0000 ni lah. Kalau kata buyer tu hanya bagi nombor my card, so nombor TIN ni boleh letak E10010 ni, seperti mana yang ada dalam slide ni. So ada pilihan lah, sama ada nak bagi TIN atau bagi my card, atau buyer boleh bagi kedua-dua maklumat tu lah. Okay. In cases kalau kata buyer tidak memerlukan invoice, so the seller boleh issue receipt macam biasa, macam praktis yang biasa sekarang ni. Hanya kalau kata buyer tu kemudiannya nak memerlukan e-invoice, so dia hanya allow dalam bulan tu saja untuk dia mohon e-invoice. So untuk supplier pula, within the 7 days of the end of that month, kena buat consolidated invoice lah. Okay. So consolidated invoice ni akan combine all receipt, bills and invoice for transaction that did not receive invoice and undergo validation by LHDN. Okay. Untuk consolidated ni, seller can adopt either method lah, by issuing an invoice based on summary for each receipt as separate line item or as a single line item. Hanya untuk consolidated invoice ni, dia tak terpakai untuk self-bill e-invoice. Okay. The next slide menunjukkan kepada aktiviti perniagaan yang tidak dibenarkan untuk membuat consolidated e-invoice. Bermakna aktiviti ini perlu mengeluarkan e-invoice. Okey, kat sini ada 7 aktiviti. Pertamanya adalah automotive, aviation, luxury good and jewellery, construction, wholesalers and retailers of construction material, license, battling and gaming, payment to agent, dealers and distribution. Okay, so aktiviti ni tidak dibenarkan untuk buat consolidate, mesti keluarkan invoice. Dalam membantu perniagaan atau syarikat untuk mengeluarkan invoice ni, boleh refer juga kepada slide yang sebelum ni, iaitu transaction with buyer, issue of invoice to buyer untuk individual punya maklumat lah. Okay. Seterusnya berkaitan dengan statement based on periodic basis. So this slide address the generation of periodic invoice or statement. In various industry and business, the issuance of invoice or receipt to document the sale of goods and services is a common practice. Statements are typically generated on a monthly, quarterly, semi-annual or annual basis, depending on prevailing business practices. To align with the implementation of e-invoicing, LHDN allows sellers to issue e-invoice for validation purpose using the foundation of issuing statement or bill based on existing business practice. Once LHDN validate the e-invoice, the seller can utilize the statement or bill as a visual representation, incorporating a QR code for the buyer. The frequency of e-invoice issuance corresponds to how often the seller sends out invoice or statements. In instance where the buyer does not require an e-invoice, the seller retains the option to issue and submit a standard statement or bill. Subsequently, the seller must issue a consolidated invoice for validation purpose. Okay, next slide ni berkaitan dengan disbursement and reimbursement. Okay, untuk reimbursement, ni melibatkan the payment of expenses incurred by the payer for services or the sales of good transaction. So, reimbursement ni include refund for payment made by the employee on behalf of the employer, like accommodation cost or flight ticket. Manakala untuk disbursement pula, refer to expenses borne by the buyer and payment made by a third party to the supplier for services or the sales of goods to the buyer. Contohnya macam credit card ke, debit card or e-wallet. Okay. Untuk ini, the supplier is required to incorporate reimbursement and disbursement information in the invoice submitted to the buyer. Okay. Untuk senario yang pertama, supplier 1 issue an invoice to the buyer for the services provided or the sales of goods with payment made by supplier 2, okay, to supplier 1 based on the agreement antara buyer and supplier 2. Dalam senario ni, supplier 1 akan issue invoice for the service or good to the buyer, manakala supplier 2 akan issue juga invoice to the buyer untuk specific item. Contohnya macam service charge. So, dalam invoice yang di-issue oleh supplier 1, dia tak perlu include apa yang dalam supplier 2 punya invoice to the buyer lah. So, for payment verification, supplier 2 is only required to provide proof of payment made to supplier 1. Untuk senario yang kedua, where is supplier 1 issue an invoice to supplier 2 for the sale of goods or services provided to the buyer, And then supplier 2 ni dia buat bayaran kepada supplier 1 based on the agreement between the buyer and supplier 2. Subsequently, supplier 2 akan issue invoice to the buyer recording the amount paid on behalf of the buyer. Dalam invoice supplier 2 ni akan mengandungi maklumat sales of goods or services and akan display 2 items in the invoice. Pertamanya dia akan service charge or reimbursement and reimbursement.